So the Wednesday night Xavier win this season when Pipkins hit that little runner and it took like 30 seconds to actually fall through the net.
Yeah.
The next morning I wore it to my 8:30 sports marketing class and Professor Horn was like, "Why the hell are you wearing a Xavier hat?" And I'm like, "Cuz I'm spiteful, that's why."
That's next level.
That was a nice move by Pipkins, taking it right to the rack himself. Wide open three, left wing, and it's good. Nylon, the dunk likes that, Matt.
A three from the right side, and it's good! The one, Pipkins, the man, yet again.
Hello and welcome to The Flex. I'm Matt St. Jean.
And I'm Joe Howie.
And we're back with our Big East preview. We're really starting to get to the meat of the Big East Conference, starting with Xavier Musketeers coming in 7th in the preseason coaches poll. And this is where you start to get into that next tier where once you hit 7, it's Xavier, Marquette, Seton Hall, UConn, Providence. These are a lot of teams where there's not a whole lot separating them. And you can see a team like Xavier really shooting up the ranks if they're a good team, maybe even falling off, but they're certainly in that middle tier of the Big East where year after year you see things get really complicated. So this is going to be an interesting team to break down for sure. Xavier went 19-13 last year, 8-10 in Big East play. And they ended the season on a sour note. You had that loss at Providence. I'm sure you Friars fans remember Lawan Pipkins hitting that dagger 3, followed by the floater in the lane. It took forever to fall. Then we talked about in the last episode, Kamar Baldwin hitting the buzzer beater 3 to beat Xavier. That was the last game of the regular season. And then they lost to DePaul in the Big East tournament, going from a potential bubble team to almost definitely out of a would-be NCAA tournament to end last year with head coach Travis Steele. And now you're losing some guys from that team. You lose forward Tyreek Jones, your guard Quentin Gooden, and then, of course, Najee Marshall, who is the centerpiece for Xavier. Joe, how do the Musketeers rebuild themselves for this season? How much are they going to miss these guys?
So, I mean, just real quick, I think Najee Marshall and Tyreek Jones were the two staple pieces to the Xavier offense and defense last year. Both of them were great two-way players. Specifically, Tyreek Jones, who averaged a double-double each game and was one of the more physical rebounders and box-out kings in the paint last year. But Xavier does have a handful of guys that are returning. I can name you 4 out of what could be a potential starting 5 right now, and we'll start at the point with Paul Scruggs. He's the only Xavier returning player that averaged more than 10 points a game. He averaged just under 3 assists, and Najee Marshall averaged 4 assists. So Paul Scruggs is going to have to pump those numbers up a little bit. He's going to be their leader. He's going to be their go-to guy. He can play quick, and he can score. Up next at the 2 is Kyky Tandy. He's a shooting guard. Didn't really see a lot of the time on the court last year. Expect his minutes to go up. He's going to be a work in progress. He's got to improve his scoring, improve his assist play, especially if he's going to be playing the 2. But then, I think right here is the most interesting set of players to return for Xavier. A pair of matchup nightmares in Zach Freemantle and Jason Carter. They're both listed at the 4 position, but Zach Freemantle is likely going to play the 5 at 6'9", 225. Jason Carter will play the 4 at 6'8", 227. Quick side note, early on in the prep, Matt said he was 275 and was a defensive tackle. So I would think he'd play the 5.
A verbal typo, tackle, if you will.
But yeah, no, for these 2 guys specifically, they didn't average a ton of points last season, but they do have a little more finesse around the rim than Tyreek Jones. And listen, Jones was a great player, big physical guy, but he scored a lot because he was dominant in the paint. These 2, they can stretch the floor a little bit. They're not true centers. They're not true power forwards. They're kind of in the middle. Expect them to play a more attractive style of offense where they're going to be shooting the ball more and stretching the court. The difference here between these 2 and Tyreek Jones is that they are going to be not as physical on defense. So it's going to be interesting to see them match up against some more physical offensive teams in the Big East. One that comes to mind right now is Seton Hall, who's going to have Mamu Kelishvili at the 4 and Obiagu at the 5. So Mamu and Obiagu are 2 physical players, whereas Freemantle and Carter, or they focus a little more on offense, a little less on defense. So that's going to be a big jump for them, and that's definitely going to be a transition point for Xavier where they're going to have to do some work because you can't have guys giving up points in the paint, but then going down and scoring because everyone knows in the Big East the defense is going to win.
Yeah, no, I mean that's a great point right there. I mean, Seton Hall could be a very tough matchup for them. I think you also look at the starting lineup for Xavier and you can draw a comparison to Providence. Obviously, we haven't gotten there yet, but your starting lineup, you've got a guy like Nate Watson, who's an offense first center. He compares to a guy like Freemantle. Jason Carter, who's probably going to play the four for Xavier, as a guy that transferred in and is still getting his footing a little bit, played last year, but is going to see a much bigger role this year. He compares to a guy like Nate Horkler, another offensive first guy. Then you've got your bigger guard with length, Paul Scruggs and David Duke. You've got a guy like Kyky Tandy, who in some ways is the undersized guard, will compare to Jared Bynum. And the guy we haven't talked about at all, Nate Johnson, who's the transfer from Gardner Webb, who averaged 13.5 points there. He is 6'4". He can kind of anchor the middle of that lineup. He's not as good of a shooter as a guy like AJ Reeves, but you can draw a comparison there too. And that's what, when we talk about getting to the middle of the Big East, you see it every year where you have a handful of teams locked between 8-10 or 10-8 in conference play, and it's going to be different now. There's going to be 20 games. But you're going to have that group that's in the middle where it's how you handle the tough games and how you handle some of these individual matchups that matters. So as a Providence fan, looking at this from a Providence perspective, Xavier is one of those teams that could scare you, but I think there's reasons to be optimistic about how PC would handle them as well.
And I like this Xavier team, like you said, Matt. There's always a logjam right in the middle of the Big East, and it's no coincidence that year in and year out, Xavier is one of these teams right in the middle of the logjam, in the dogfight, the rock fight, whatever you want to call it, or even higher than that. They're an aggressive team. However, their defense is going to take a little bit of a hit this year. Last season, KenPom had them ranked as one of the top defenses nationally. That's going to slip without Marshall and Jones, so it's going to see definitely a big transition on the defensive end of the court for them. So it's going to be interesting to see how they compare to all these other Big East teams that are traditionally in the logjam in the middle. Let's say Marquette, Seton Hall, Providence, UConn. I'd even throw Butler in the mix too. It's going to be a rock fight right in the thick of it.
Yeah, and that's where you're looking at a guy like a Kyky Tandy. He was a all-freshman first team last year. Had a really good first season. If he can elevate his game and add to those scoring totals, fill in that gap that you lose with Quentin Gooden, that's how you could make that up on the defensive end. I mean, you're going to be asking a lot of newcomers here, and it's going to all, like, Paul Scruggs has to be the leader for them. He was voted a captain alongside Jason Carter and Zach Freemantle. He's got to run the show, and he's got to make this offense go for them this season. And then a couple other interesting notes as you look down this lineup. You have two four-star freshmen, Dwan Odom and CJ Wilcher. We don't know how much playing time they're going to get. They play the guard and the wing. Wilcher's 6'5". Guys like that, we don't know how much time they're going to get. And then there's two transfers who are awaiting waivers. We don't know if they're going to play. Adam Kunkel from Belmont and Ben Stanley from Hampton. Both average double-digit points per game. So if guys like that get waivers and are able to play, suddenly you're looking at something very different for Xavier. I guess at this point it's unlikely that they get it this close to the season starting, but something to look at going forward. Now, since we are close to this season starting, we do have a schedule to look at for Xavier. So running it down, they're going to open the season against Oakland, and they're going to play a whole host of these lower tier teams: Bradley, Toledo, Eastern Kentucky, Tennessee Tech, all home games. Then you get Cincinnati on the road, Oklahoma at home, and your Big East schedule starts at the not the Dunkin' Donuts Center, at Alumni Hall. With the Friars. What do you think of that schedule? What are the big games for them, Joe?
Well, looking down the line, this first five, they're low major schools, and obviously Xavier has a history of success in a high major program. I think that's 5-0 off the bat. At Cincinnati, I think that's going to be a tough game, especially after holding your own at home 5 games straight. So I think that's their first real test, and then they return home for Oklahoma again, another test, and then Big East play. They start off with two of the higher ranked teams in the Big East at Providence and at home against Seton Hall. I think that is where Xavier is going to have to, really kick the door down because these are two teams, Providence and Seton Hall, that are projected to be in what is supposed to be an upper tier of the Big East. I mean, there's so many different calculations of the way that the Big East is going to land this year, but from what I've heard, there's a couple of tiers. Providence and Seton Hall in the upper tier. Then you're at DePaul, at home against Marquette, and then you travel to Creighton. So DePaul and Marquette should be easier games for Xavier because DePaul, as we know, is going to likely reside in the basement of the Big East, and Marquette lost their leading scorer. At Creighton should be a toughie. Creighton is ranked second in the Big East, so that's definitely going to be another early on test for the Musketeers. But again, you have this nice, comfortable non-conference schedule to really rack up your wins and go into the Big East with a cushion, which is something I think is so important for every team in this conference because if you go in with a poor non-conference play and you can't really clean up in conference, you're not looking at an at-large bid in March.
No, and this is certainly a Xavier team with tournament aspirations this year. Like you said, shortened non-conference makes every one of those games even more important, especially when it's going to be as hard as it's ever been to even be 500 in the Big East this season. So those games against Cincinnati and Oklahoma, that's where that's where your bread is buttered. That's what gets you those
Resume
opportunities
builders.
for March. Yes, that's where it all matters for Xavier. Starting off the season soon. This has been our Big East season preview for them. We are going to be back next time with our preview of Marquette. For Joe Howie, I'm Matt St. Jean. This has been the Flex Big East preview. Follow us on Twitter at the Flex Hoops, and thank you for listening.
Go Friars.